Um, okay, so what I want to do today is to start a discussion of probability in and the way in which the halachic concept of probability interacts with conceptions of what reality actually is. And then my hope is that this will take us into a discussion of an article by Rabbi Alex Ozar, which is only footnoted in the article, but I think is really terrific, on Rosh Shkaf, and the question of whether there are things that are religiously mandated or prohibited, even though there is nothing in halacha about them whatsoever. Is it possible to have gaps? Not just the question of Limshur Sadin or anything like that, but just things where halacha chooses not to say something, even though one's conception of what God's will does say something. Okay, that's the big issue. What I want to do today is just try to introduce the subject. So we're going to start, and the way I'm planning to do it is we're going to read a snippet of Gemara Rishon, and then we're going to read what I said about it in the chapter. Hopefully, what I said about in the chapter will be more comprehensible after reading the text than beforehand, and evaluate. Do you think that what I say about it is correct or compelling, and does it constitute a flowing argument? So start with the Gemara. The Gemara says, out of nowhere, for our purposes, Minaha milsa de amur rabbanan zil basar ruba. So Minaha milsa is the equivalent of Minolan or blanking out the Hebrew minayin, but it's usually a request for a biblical source. But in Talmudic epistemology, svara is equivalent to a biblical source. Right, so you can answer the question minayin with svara. Right. So what is the source? And that is interesting phrase. Pad de amur rabbanan. Right. What is the source of this rabbinic expression? So let's so interesting idea. What is the status of a rabbinic expression? Right. Where does it play a role in halacha? Where does it come from? Really interesting question. Don't know. So here's what the rabbinic statement is: Zil basar ruba. Follow the rule. Okay, a rule is variously definable as either a majority or a plurality. You have to decide which of those you think is necessarily referred to as the thing of which there is the most, or the thing which is most of. Okay, so there seems to be the claim that there is a statement made by Rabbanan. We don't know whether a statement made by Rabbanan necessarily reflects a consensus or not. Right, but at least some rabbis, right? What is the source of this statement, which is made by at least some rabbis, quote, saying, go after the road. So the Gemara responds with these parenthetical asides, and you can make up your own mind as to whether these parenthetical asides are the product of a single author or the reflection of a later redactor coming in and say, what? Right, some of them I think are plainly, I think it is plainly a literary device in the Gemara to say something and then to stop and say, what? But I don't know which one it is here. I say, you're asking a question? So there's a pasuk which says Rabim Latod, and that sounds exactly like Zil Basaruba. So Deborah's raising her eyebrows at me because she, of course, knows that the pasuk actually tells you not to follow Acharei Rabim, right? Lo ti'acharei, right? Lo tanel riv lintos Acharei Rabim Latos. And so if you read it as a single phrase, Lo tanel riv lintos Acharei Rabim Latod, it's a negative, right? But the assumption of this interjection is that you all know you're supposed to read it as Lo tanel riv latot, Lo tanel riv lintot, right? Acharei Rabim Latot. Yes, so is that what the eyebrows were about? Okay. So at least whoever writes the interjections thinks that it is obvious that there is a verse which says Acharei Rabim Latot, and therefore it's ridiculous to ask the question, what's the source of the rabbinic expression? Zil Basaruba is just an Aramaic translation. Ruba de Isa Kaman. Kegon tet chanayot v'sanhedrin lo kamei boilan, kamei boilan ruba de lese kaman yel katan uktana, and then we have when it comes to repetition we say minolan again. Right now that we have the question accurate. Okay, so we have a distinction between a ruba de isa kaman and a ruba de lesa kaman. Ruba de isa kaman is defined as a case where one case is where you find a piece of meat and you don't know which store it came from. but you have a majority. The majority of stores is kosher. The majority of stores is trade, whichever way you want it to be. So you follow, right? So the halachic status of that meat follows the majority of the locations from which it was likely to have come. Okay, now that issue needs to be complicated in lots of ways. First of all, there's a difference between whether you find the meat on the street in front of the stores, or you took the meat from one of the stores, you don't remember which. One is called kavua. If you took it from a specific place, you can't remember which specific place. Right, then it's called kavua, and we treat that as a 50-50 case no matter what. If you find it somewhere where it's already left its original location, and obviously we could spend the rest of our lives just trying to figure out exactly what constitutes having left its original place or not. And we can write the magic word to say is here's the makom leidat hasafek, the place where the suffix or leidas hasafek, right? The place where the doubt began, whether that's a subject or object, we're going to leave all that aside. We're not doing that. But if you define the piece of meat as having left its as having left its original location by the time that you start evaluating, right? Then you can say that it probably came from the majority. Again, it's fine, right? What happens if one of the meat shops is bigger than one of the others? What if you go more often to one of the meat shops than the others? You go by majority, volume, weight, all sorts of things. We're going to bracket all those things also, right? We're going to imagine there's some platonic world in which the pieces of meat are interchangeable, bits of data, and all stores are exactly the same size, are equally likely to have things drop. Give bags of exactly the same strengths, or equally like that. All those sort of things. Okay. I also assume the 9 out of 10 and 51 out of 100 are exactly the same thing. I assume 9 out of 10 and 501 out of 1,000 and 5 right, and 50,001 right, all those things, right? We're assuming all those, we're assuming all that. Okay. The sex, right? So there's one case that this counts for the piece of meat found in front of the collection of stores, and the other is the Sanhedrin. So what do we mean by a Sanhedrin? Presumably, we're talking about a vote on the Sanhedrin, and that probably is the best we can come up with the context for Rabim Hatot. So if you have some kind of context of a vote, then the majority rules. Again, majority or plurality. That's the whole right. That's assuming that there's a binary outcome, right? So it's easy to talk about majorities. There isn't the binary outcome, and it's not so easy, right? Whether you go by outcomes or rationales, right? That's an issue on the Supreme Court also. Right? What if there's multiple rationales and achieve the same result in this specific case? To what extent you set precedent? Those are all cool issues that we're going to have to bracket. But what would you say is but right, there are two cases that are the same, which are the meat in front of the stores and the vote on Sanhedrin. There's one case which is different, which is the katan and the ktana. So the case of the katan is whether you're allowed to assume that the katana ktana will grow up into whatever you consider to be normal adults. And normally, right, the normal way of thinking about normal adults in this context is going to be sexual maturity, but you could think of other contexts such as mental stability, responsibility, all sorts of things like that. So can we say that can we do something with a katana now that on a presumption that most katanim and katanot will turn out to be normal adults, mainstream adults within the whatever you want to call them. Like that we really get if we're talking about role, well, they turn out to have the characteristics that are characteristic of 50.1% of adults. Right. So obviously that's going to be gendered. Right, because you have 51% of adults are male, you're not going to assume that a female child is going to grow up to be a male or vice versa. Right. So there are all sorts of criteria by that. But there are all sorts of other ways which we might use lineage or genetics or anything like that to predict if 50.1% of adults are more than 5'4", this would be a very small child. But we're assuming that we're dealing with things that affect generic halachic status, which is going to be either physical characteristics or mental characteristics. Okay, what's the difference between the cases, right? It sounds by implication that's called a ruba de lesa kaman as opposed to a ruba de isa kaman. So what, right? You have to define what's the difference between a ruba de isa kaman and a ruba de lesa kaman. Right, we're going to say that the pasuk achari rabim latut only tells us. Here we should be very careful. Only tells us either that we must follow the majority or that we may follow the majority. That's also ambiguous. In cases of Aruba de Isa Kaman, but does not give us that information. The pasuk by itself does not give us that information regarding Aruba de Lesa Kaman. So, yes, sir. Uh-huh.
Is about a situation where you have all
Mm-hmm.
and a situation where you have a lot of the information, but one piece of information you most is which group a particular person will someday belong to. And so you have to use the information you have to get the information you don't.
Mm-hmm.
The other possibility, simpler way of saying it, is counting up things that already exist.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that we need to challenge. The first is when you talk about counting possibilities. So this counting possibilities, relate to, is voting really a counting of possibilities? You can imagine voting being about possibilities if you think that we're counting the possibilities, it's what the truth is. But it's not, right? But it's clearly not the same as counting up possibilities as to where the meat came from. So you have to think about whether that formulation is precise. On the other hand, you have to think about the Rubid Less Kaman necessarily requires information about the future. Right? That's correct. It only gave us one example. Right. So the question is right? It happens that example relates to information about it relates to knowledge of something that has not yet happened, but it's not obviously true that is. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I guess any of the rabbis, if the child did something that say then they die or they have a chance to get valid, invalid, or will never.
Well, that's exactly the case the Gemara is going to bring up. So I can't, right? So we'll have to. Sorry, then I need to make sure how precisely you're framing the question. Say it again.
Suppose that
Uh-huh.
And then drop dead the next one.
Yeah.
Do we say the only thing that would have made it not that didn't happen? So definitely sin. Do we say it was a sin because that would depend on whether she would have.
Okay, I don't want to. Good question. I don't want to answer it yet. Right, that's a really good question. Can you think of a case though that isn't about the future, that would still be different than the other two? Right, that would still be that would different than the Chaniyots and the well, let's take.
Let's talk about Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Not talking about. Talking about if you have, you know what the vote is.
Right, you're trying to hear what,
yeah. Follow the majority rule.
Yeah, Sanhedrin is an easy case, right? Which doesn't really fit, right? Sanhedrin is the easiest case to say, right? It's just a heuristic, it's a political heuristic, right? What do you do? Right? It doesn't tell anything about the nature of the world, doesn't tell anything about the nature of truth, it just is. Right. So the Sanhedrin is probably in a sense, the easiest case and difficult to we could talk about what happened, we could talk about what happens if there's a majority that didn't vote, right? That would be the part of the case of Sanhedrin, right? If I know that most poskim say this, but they never met to discuss. Right, that's an interesting question whether that constitutes a ruba de ita kaman. I guess that's a good way of thinking about it, right? Does ruba de ita kaman mean that they have the key factors that people actually voted? Is the key factors that we're all in a room, right? Therefore, we can bracket the question who gets to vote. Right? Is it just the fact, right? Or is it that we know exactly how many people get to vote? So we're not right that the denominator is fixed. All right, that right. It might be that's the key characteristic is that the denominator is fixed. The denominator is fixed at something less than the total number of x in the world. Maybe it's ruba less than come on anytime I base probabilities on a numerator that is the denominator that's defined as all instances of x in the world. Right. So the question is, right, what happens if well, it hasn't happened yet. Well, I don't know, but let's go both ways, right? It is, let's say this way. Let's suppose I know that most of the bagels of the world are kosher.
Well,
Let's assume most of the not hefshered, but kosher. All right, right. So that most of the bagels in the world are kosher. So I'm wandering through Podunk, Iowa, and I find a paper bag with a bagel in it. It smells yummy. Can I eat the bagel? It could have come from any bagel store in the world. Is that a ruba de isa kaman? Because I know, right? Because it's right, or is that a ruba de lesa kaman? Right. I'm wandering through, right. I'm wandering through the international arrivals terminal, right, at JFK. Right. So now it really could have come from anywhere, right? From anywhere in the world, right? So is that enough, right? If I say, like, I know most of the bagels in the world are kosher, they'll ask me, how do I know that all the bagels in the world are kosher? That was the question, right? Right, good issue, right? So maybe it had maybe the definition is that I know something. I have personal acquaintance with every option in the denominator. Right. Maybe that's right. We haven't even talked about the question: what happens if, right, instead of 9 kosher stores and 1 kosher store is 9 hefshered stores, 1 tray store is 9 hefshered stores, and 1 tray store, but the tray store sells some kosher products. Right, because not every meat is easy because meat has to be hefshered. Things have to have been done to it. The bagels things have to just not have been done to it. Right, so it's complicated to figure out exactly what the boundary is. Right, we have an instinct that that it makes it voting is pretty clear. Although again, I could imagine, right, there are Asimov stories in which the whole world votes. Right, there's a marvelous Asimov story in which only one person votes on behalf of the whole world because computers determined that this is the representative voter. Election day is just watching this one person make up their mind, and everything is perfectly determined as a result. Okay, so that's right. So I think that I think we can. This is one of the many cases in Talmud where you can where you can figure out that you have a binary. You have cases that fit on this side of the binary, and you have cases that fit on that side of the binary. That doesn't mean that that you either understand it conceptually or that you have a predictive principle. It just means that there's intuition, and the intuition is good enough to draw a line between here and here with a big buffer zone. But if you want to make lumdish claims, right, then you need formulations, right? That's in a sense what Brisk contributes. Is right to say it's not enough to say that I can handle most cases on the basis of this intuitive heuristic. I actually need to be able to put it into language, and that language has to be clear enough, right? That's what Deborah's always going to challenge. Language has to be clear enough that it actually generates an almost universally predictive principle. If I know everything about the case, then if you can tell me everything that's true about the case, then I can tell you which side of the line it belongs on, because my tool is a very precise tool. And ideally, right, that's the advantage. The language should be objective. Absolutely. Okay. So here's what I said about it. Here we go. Right. So I started by having a Jackie Mason joke. Right. There's 50% chance of rain. Half an umbrella doesn't keep you dry. And by the same token, Jackie Mason did say that it's not a sensible reaction to a 50% chance of rain is not to take an umbrella half the time. That makes no sense at all. I don't think. Right? You just end up, either it makes sense to carry an umbrella when there's a 50% chance of rain, or it doesn't. Right? Carrying an umbrella 50% of the time is just playing with randomness. Let's say right? So probability and reality don't interact smoothly. Second question talked about, which is experience I think many people had. I had as a freshman in college, taking not taking the intro to philosophy class, but taking the class after the intro to philosophy class with Professor Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, Alav Shalom, in which he first introduced me to what my friend Chacham Aryeh Greenberg calls the epistemological abyss, which is the realization that every way of knowing something cannot be verified, definitionally can't be verified by itself. Right? So there can't be a logical way of proving that logic is true. All right, that's what sends some people crashing down. And for me, the crash was realizing that I can't figure out what the odds are the probability is true. Right? What would it mean? Right? And so I went a little bit nuts. I remember asking, going on a long rant about whether I think inviting Rabbi Wurzburger to eat the chair I was sitting on because it might taste like a hot dog. And just because up till now chairs haven't tasted like hot dogs. It's just, he I think very calmly explained to me there was a difference between philosophy and life. And particularly, he encouraged me to jump out the third floor window. Because just because people died last time. It hurt, but it would hurt this time. Right? That was I think it was fortunate that I had Rabbi Wurzburger as my teacher in that regard, because some people never recover from the experience. And I had that moment where where he sort of called me back to reality, but I still struggle with it. Very grateful to teachers who, another example I mentioned is, though it's irrelevant, but it's useful. When I was I think a sophomore in college, maybe a junior, I became enamored of deconstruction as a tool of literary criticism, literary analysis. Deconstructionists, I believe that all books contradict themselves, and the insight that Deborah and I argue about really that the perfect parody is indistinguishable from the original work, and therefore you can never tell whether a book is an original or a parody of itself. Because if they were making a parody, they would do exactly the same thing. So I was taking a course on the development of the novel, and I was finding the early novels really, really boring, and really, really boring. And Professor Will Lee was quite attached to was quite attached to the novels he was teaching, and I wrote a series of papers arguing that they were all satires on the genres they started. Which upset him a great deal. We had a whole sort of conversation. Usually gave me really bad grades on them, and then I would, sit in his office and go through all the evidence, and sometimes even convinced him that there are elements of satire in the novel that started the genre. And then we were getting up to Austin, and Austin at that point was Sifrei Kodesh for him. And he looked at me and said, "You're not going to do this to Austin also, are you?" And I said, "Sure, I will." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, what will you do with Tanakh?" And that was a really good question. And that was a question that kept me from going all the way off the deep end down deconstruction. That at some point I had to preserve a notion of Tanakh. Although there are Yonah particularly is fun to read as a satire. Could be. Again, can't distinguish. Okay, William Safire has his reading of Eov, right, where it's it's the thing you always point out, right? He says children die, he gets replacement children. Does anybody really mean that seriously? That's what's gonna make him happy? Have some children, that's all. So, right, Safire, again, if presumptions, right, or really wise people, and this person just doesn't listen. Okay, well, we won't talk about Jonathan Swift now. Okay, so for that matter, what are the odds that probability is usefully predictive? This sort of puzzle twists some of us into epistemological pretzels. Our friends wonder why we care, since they're 100% sure it works well in our reality. Great mathematicians, physicists, and fantasy writers wonder what it would be like to live in a different kind of reality. Also Talmudists, right? That's the intro to our sugya. Because on 11a, the Talmud asks, "From whence cometh that thing the rabbi says, Zil bat Taruba?" Not in the context of voting, right? So that's what a Sanhedrin is. Nor in bounded sets, right? So that's my definition of Ruben Isa Kaman. It's a bounded set, right? Which I'm trying to argue is where all the, you can individually identify all the objects in the denominator. Right? Such as which of 32 ping pongs will emerge first from a cage, right? Ping pong will emerge first from a cage, which is the equivalent, which is another kind of case, right? Because that is, right, that's challenging because that is a future thing. Right? The other is 1 out of 32 is the 1 in 32 chance that each of these will that each of these will emerge from a case. And maybe you'll argue it has no nafkamina until it's actually emerged, right? That's a whole interesting question. Such cases derive from the verb acharei rabim latot. The question relates to context, which require us to predict the future. Here, I went with the formulation on the basis of past experience. Right, so that's another way of defining it. I didn't do a good job, I guess, in the book of being precise enough. Right, right, we can say the difference is it about knowledge of the present, or is it about knowledge predicting the future based on past experience? And we have a space we haven't nailed, which is the area, things that are based where the denominator is the entire world, but it's about the present, and things which are about the future, but with a bounded set. Right? Those are the great cases we haven't fit out. Okay, so what does the Gemara say to that? Right. So this the sugya in Chulin doesn't build out what katan and katana are, but the sugya in Yevamos of Samach Aleph Beis does build out what the case is. So we have a bright Tanya. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Kohen L'Yisa Taktana. Rabbi Eliezer says that a Kohen cannot marry a minor girl. And the Gemara explains, right, who it is in the Gemara is not my issue right now. That's why it's right. Savar Lak Rabbi Meir Dechayesh L'Miuta. This is a really fascinating thing, right? So the position you can't marry a Ktana is the position of a mayor who is concerned for the minority. The question we have to figure out is, when a mayor says he's concerned for the minority, does that mean that the Rabbanan who say Zil Basaruba are the Rabbanan of Rabbi Meir, meaning that their position is defined in opposition to Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir denies Zil Basaruba? And so Rabbi Meir is living in this alternate universe. Right? To deny Zil Basaruba means to live in a world without probability.
No, that would be.
For halachic man or woman, right? Lives in a world, right? According to Meir, if we set it up now, denies Zil Basaruba. Now he doesn't. Let's suppose he doesn't deny Zil Basaruba in the context of voting, right? Probably Rabbi Meir agrees that that you follow the majority in the vote. Well, again, we'll have to figure out who follows the majority in the vote: the people who voted, or the constituency of the people who voted. And you can define it both ways. You can say that everyone is bound by the vote except for the people in the vote, and you can say everyone is bound, that only the people in the vote are bound by the vote, or you can say both. Right, and then but presumably, let's say for now, although again, I'm reading the Sugya in Yevamos does. The Sugya in Chulin seems to incorporate the Sugya in Yevamos, but the Sugya in Yevamos doesn't mention the Sugya in Chulin. Right, so the Sugya in Chulin says Katan Ktana, it's probably talking about the Sugya in Yevamos, but when the Sugya in Yevamos doesn't say anything that it doesn't say that it's agreed to that tangent or that interjection in Chulin that says we're not talking about Aruba Disa Kama. Right, so it could be Rameir is cholik on Zilbaz. We have to ask you, or only on one of those two cases. Rameir has, presumably, although maybe Rameir even goes back to the point Deborah wanted and thinks that after Rabbi Mlatot, you're misreading the pasuk. That's a look to say. Don't. All right, so we are at this point we don't know. We have this mysterious position that shows up all over Shas, not necessarily meaning the same thing all the time. The Rameir is the person who is Chayesh L'Miuta, which we hypothesize means Rameir rejects Zil Basaruba. So the Gemara then says, right, you're claiming Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rameir, but really Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold like Rameir. Rameir misavarla. In Tanya, we have a Breita which is going to set us up into a machloket Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer. Two Breitas really. One Breita will be the position of Meir, and then Rabbi Eliezer is going to disagree with that position. So we're going to go through the case, but our issue is not figuring out whether Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Rabbi Meir. Our issue is figuring out what does Rabbi Meir say. Okay, so here's the case. Tanya, I have a Breita. Katan Ktana lo choltzim lo miyat min divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that you cannot do either chalitza or yibum. Well, right. Neither side of the Yibum ritual can be performed by a minor. Amar lo Rabbi Meir, so he says Rabbi Meir, Yafe amarta she'ein choltzim. I understand why they can't engage in chalitza. Ish ksiv parsha v'makshinan isha li. We have a verse. The verse says you can't do chalitza, that the male can't do chalitza unless the male is an adult. And then we have another pasuk that equates the male and the female. So now we understand that only adults can engage in chalitza. But we have no verse that tells us that only adults, only people who've reached majority, are able to engage in yibum. So Amar Leis, Rameir responds to them, Katan Shema Yimatzei Saris, Tana Shema Timatzei Islandis, Benimsu Pogin Be'erba. So we get to Deborah's case. Right? The answer is right. The case is that the reason we don't allow them to do Yibum is because of the possibility that it will turn out that one or both of them was infertile, and if one or both of them were not, doesn't go through. Okay, let's talk about what. Okay, let's say it that way, right? One or both of them will turn out to be halachically defined as not having achieved sexual maturity. I don't know if puberty is the right word. Cerise? What's the symptom?
Never breathe.
I think that's what a cerise is? Okay, could be. And if it turns out that's the case, so then because Yibum is always on this knife edge, right? That if it's mandatory, right? That's right. That if it's not Yibum, then it's incest. So it will turn out that they've engaged in incest. Okay, and that's right. So that's what Meir holds, and Rabbi Cheses says no, they can do Yibum. So that gets Rabbi Cheses, but that's not our issue, right? Our issue, right? I have to figure out why in that case he thinks a Kohen shouldn't marry a Ketana. Not our issue. All that matters is we have defined Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is the person who is Payif and Yuta, which means that he doesn't allow children to engage in activities which there is a minority possibility will turn out to have been sinful, even if there's a majority possibility that it will turn out to have been a mitzvah. Right, so that's right. So that definition gives us a very narrow context. I'm talking right because right the cost is right. So the Chayiv Yuta might mean he's concerned for minority cases only when the effect of a minority case is that something becomes a sin, maybe even becomes a sin as Payif Kares. And maybe you could even make an argument that it's only when the result of that the alternative is a mitzvah because he's worried that the mitzvah is being engaged in improperly. Or we could say that Meir is a generalized position which says that in this sort of case, the Katan and Ketana, he does not believe in Zil Basaruba. And the Ketana Ketana is not defined by any of the specific characteristics of the mitzvah characteristics of the case. The Ketana Ketana is defined by it being a Ruba to let the come up. And that's the simple way of doing it, right? Because the Gemara in Chulin defines it as as the case of Katan and Ketana as Ruba to let the come on. And this is presumably the case of Katan and Ketana. Katan and Ketana is just a quote from the Brisa, which begins Katan and Ketana lo cholse v'lo miyaber. Okay, so that means that that would mean that in fact the Zil Basaruba is the position of the Rabbanan and not the position of a Meir. And so what we're looking for in our sugya in Chulin is not how we ground a consensus, but how we establish one side of the machloket and the other side exists in halacha, and presumably has to be reasonable also. Okay. Okay, right. That's the right. So that's the way I define it. Right. The practical consequence of the specific question is esoteric. Right. Meir is cited as holding that prepubescents are forbidden to engage either yibum or chalitza. He has a verse to prove chalitza, but not yibum. Why forbid yibum? Because if either party grows up to be sterile, as defined by halacha, Deborah says, right, whatever you want definition, yibum becomes incest. Okay. Meir's colleagues dismiss this concern on the grounds that most adults are not sterile, and therefore most minors will not be sterile as adults. The Talmud generalizes this dispute. Meir consistently is concerned for minority, whereas the rabbis are not saying zil bataruba. What justifies the rabbis? Okay, so now we're back in the sugya in Chulin, and the question is, why do the rabbis reject Meir? Why are they not chayish l'miyuta? And so it's important to just figure out like which we think, right? Which do we think should be the default? If it's a generic dispute, right? You're coming in by the nupsukim. So what do we think logically should be the position? Should we care about minorities? Should we care about minorities only in cases where the result of not caring about them is a risk of sin? All right, which means we would agree zil basaruba except when the consequences are sin or grave sin or things like that. Or do we think that actually no, majority rule is what makes sense? So, right, what do we think the Torah's relationship should be to probability? And why?
I don't think it has. I usually use them. Because by narrowly, right, life is uncertain.
Okay.
Right? And,
Yeah.
and you don't have to know about every possible outcome in order to get it.
So you think that it's that I guess right what my friend Alicia calls Rabbi Cheses, practical reason means you have to make decisions based on past experience sometimes, and so you should be able to make halachic decisions the same way you make normal decisions. But probably there are cases where you won't do that, right? So let's say, for example, let's suppose I have a really heavy ball in my object right in my hand, and I throw it in your general direction, but I know that I miss 60% of the time. So am I allowed to do this? Because right, I'm aiming for your nose, but I miss 60% of the time. So am I allowed to do that? Because look, I know I usually miss.
We have a law that says that you're not allowed to engage.
That might kill people. Might. Be.
If you're
Let-
something
Uh-huh.
that was-
It's really good.
Speaking that.
So that's a really interesting argument. We won't get that far this week, but that's a really interesting argument, right? That's going to be the core of what Rabbi Ozar thinks Rosh Hashanah is talking about. Does the fact that you will be a murderer after the fact mean that you were wrong to take the risk? So there's a corollary of that, which is that you're right that you're not allowed to do anything which carries the risk of being murdered after the fact.
Yeah. There may also be some things that it's your job to make sure. Other things that it's your job to make sure that I'm purpose.
That sounds-
The same thing, and some.
Uh-huh. Okay, that sounds a little complicated for now. What is so okay? So right, so let's
And them to do to go out of their way.
yeah, okay, fair. Everybody gets carried in the formulations. But we could say, okay, we're supposed to follow the majority, except where there's a risk of A, of courage, and B, of damage to others. We could frame it that way. And Rameir is only chodesh l'miuta in the case of grave sin and damage to others, which means if the rabbis disagree with him. Well, I want to know where if Rameir is choshesh for the possibility of an Isser Karetz, that what you're doing will end up being an Isser Karetz, and the rabbis disagree. The rabbis think it's okay to do actions that carry a risk of Isser Karetz. Now you can tell me no. I don't know. Nobody said anything. Nobody said any terms in here. Other than you want to claim Rameir is chayish l'miuta means he's choshesh even for small mutes.
Well, yes. But almost all children.
You think that everybody is koshesh for for 20% chances, but Rameir is koshesh even for 1% chances. And he would be koshesh. It's true I haven't. It's true I haven't. I won't deny that I haven't. I skipped a lot of this again. But okay, interesting. Right. So now what we have to do is right. So for killing people, no chances. Right. No chance at all. We'll call it right. We'll call that by saying that and hoping to be killed. Right. So right. But what about not killing them, but just just gravely injuring them? Does the same rule apply?
I think as it gets less serious.
We end up with a that's a really interesting notion, right? So what we mean by the rule we're arguing about is a sliding scale rule. Okay, that's a very interesting notion. There aren't any second for that. Okay, I'm okay with this, right? I just pointed that it's a pretty radical thesis that the only terms we have in the Gemara so far are rov and miyut. We've now right, and there's apparently supposed to be a machloket between the mayor and the rabbanon about whether we're choshesh for miyut or not. And you're telling me no. Actually, everybody agrees we're choshesh for large miyuts, and we're not choshesh for small miyuts. And what constitutes a large miyut and what constitutes a small miyut is dependent on my evaluation of which mitzvot are worth taking risks are there's at least a 51% chance. Well, yeah. What I'm saying, it is, it's not halakhically usher to do it. And you're telling me, but it's got to be wrong. So I can say, okay, you know what? I'll make it a rabbanon about it. Right. But that's not going to satisfy you. You want God, before of Aspel to have come down and made it usher, which, by the way, but you didn't really need God to tell you that because you knew it already. But if God doesn't say it, that's what you think. Okay. It's not that if God doesn't say it, he loses, right? He loses your confidence. Okay. That could be. I just want to point out that what the boundaries of the machloket between the Rabbanan and the Mayor are not at all clear. And right, that was just given us a much more complicated machloket than we have obviously evidence by the Gemara. There are cases, the case I usually talk about where this becomes intuitively clear is beyond a reasonable doubt in American law. And American law has one standard for criminal conviction, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, whatever, right? Isn't it? But all reasonable people understand that what the definition of reasonable doubt is different in capital cases than it is in cases where the outcome is a $5 fine. Even though the words are going to be the same, right? But it's got to be a sliding scale as to what degree of proof you require. There are going to be counter principles, though, right? Because it's much more important to catch murderers than to catch people who commit offenses that are worth, right? So it might be that you should convict murderers on less evidence than people who do things that bring $5 fines, because because if you don't convict the person who jumped the turnstiles, well, you have another turnstile jumper. You don't convict a murderer, you have another murderer, assuming that murderers are at risk, right? And I know the Rambam says no, right? The Rambam is fully on that, right? Okay, right? But yeah, sure. Okay. So let's take a look at the Sugya and Fulin, right? That's probably right. What the Sugya and Fulin does to answer the question. Right, so Rabbi Lezer, for example, brings in the claim that the proof that we follow the rove in a ruba de lesa kaman is that we can eat a korban ola, and he says, look, there's something that the problem is that you're not allowed to. Let's take the korban pesach was the next one. I just want to show you the structure of Sugya. But you're not allowed to break the bones of korban pesach. But there are forms of trachos that makes the korban pesach halachically inedible that can only be verified if you break a bone. So now we're stuck. The Torah says you can eat a korban pesach, but the only way, right? But the Torah says you can't break the bones of a korban pesach. You can't eat it if you've broken the bones, and if you're choshesh for miyuta, so there's a possibility, right? You should have to check. You actually have to check for every possibility of trephos, right? We check basically just lungs, right? We inflate the lungs to check for small punctures. We don't check the other organ. We don't inflate the other organs to check for small punctures. But so if you're really choshesh, if you really don't follow zil basaruba, so then you should not be able to eat any animal unless you have checked every possible trephos. And a korban pesach, you cannot check for every possible trephos without creating a new one. Okay, so that proves we must say zil basaruba in that case. Okay, the Gemara is going to reject it by saying that there's another mode. There's another way to check there. You can boil it, and that'll soften it enough that you can get to right. You can't eat the meat. Okay, then boil it. I don't know. Well, okay. All it matters is there's a way of doing it, right? You're trying to prove that there is a statement in the Torah that only makes sense if you follow Rov, or there's a mitzvah in the Torah that only becomes possible if you follow Rov? The answer is no. Right, there is a way to do it. Now, obviously, the proof assumes that there can't be mitzvah in the Torah that are halakhically impossible. So we could just answer, no, you're right. We should never eat a korban pesach. Okay, no. The Torah says eat a korban pesach. It must be possible. We're okay with never killing a ben saramora, or we're not okay with never eating a korban pesach. Okay. So the Gemara has a whole series of others, right? There are, right? I put you the right. Rabbi Cheses offers his example, and they all basically try proofs of the same sort. Rav Murray tries, one of the more interesting proofs. He says that we could never, we should never be able to execute somebody for striking their father, because you can never prove that somebody, right? The whole basis for assuming fatherhood is majority. Right? They didn't have DNA. So the Gemara says, no, we could say that you only do it if the parents were locked in prison, there was no one else there, and the Gemara answers famously, "Ena b'trombos l'rayos." Right? People can be locked in a maximum security prison with 100,000-foot walls. We don't assume that it was impossible for them to have a sexual liaison with somebody, right? With somebody outside the walls, and therefore paternity is, among other things, right? Therefore paternity, or the postman will do what he sees, whatever it may be. Therefore, right? And right, therefore, the Gemara says that paternity is always going to be a function of majority. And that the Gemara doesn't have an answer to, right? So one of the, if we were doing the sugya structurally, we see there are certain things where the Gemara seems to have proven its point. But if we continue with the sugya, so Rabbi Ashi comes along. Rabbi Ashi says, "Asya meshchita atzma." We'll just prove it from the mere fact of shchita, because the Torah says, doesn't ever say it, but let's suppose it says it. The Torah says that you can eat if once you have shafted an animal, you can eat. Or at least once you have shafted an animal and you do X number of other activities, it must be possible to eat meat. It's possible to eat meat, maybe, right? Maybe at the place where the knife cut the throat while you're doing shchita, there was a mum. So maybe the act of shchita made it impossible for you to know whether there was a mum or not. Okay, in another sugya, which we won't get into now, right? That's also the Gemara also raised that as a possibility against convicting murder. But okay, because you can never know that the murdered person wasn't the trefa, and it's not a capital crime to kill a trefa. Here the Gemara asks the question in the context of kashrus. How can you know? Right, so it must be we say zil basaruba. And Rav Ashi says, I said this in front of Rav Kahana, and Rav Kahana said in Rav Simi, and he said the whole mode of proof is false. Because if you're trying to prove it from a case where something would be impossible unless you said zil basaruba, all you've proven is that we say zil basaruba when the alternative is impossible. You haven't proven that we say zil basaruba where there's an alternative. Right, so the whole mode of argument is right. So Arsimi said, if you're trying to prove zil basaruba, right, zil basaruba as a general principle, the attempt to prove that the Torah assumes in specific cases is false. Right, is useless. All it says, yeah, Rameir agrees. We're not kosher shlemuta. We're being kosher shlemuta with l'mei mitzvah. But the question is, the babes in Rameir and the Rabbanan is about whether we say zil basaruba when we can live without it. And that, right, Rasimi says to Rashi, Rakana says to Rav, or Rasimi says to Rakana says to Rashi, that you haven't proven at all. Because he says, if you don't accept this distinction, right, between places that we rely on majority because there is no alternative, and places that we rely on majority where there is an alternative, so then the position, chayesh l'muta, should mean you never eat meat. He'll tell me, okay, so Rameir was a vegetarian. You can't eat meat. Yay. No, Rameir has to eat a korban pesach. Right, so since there's a mitzvah to eat meat, right, so therefore, right, so he has to, his position has to allow for the possibility of eating the meat of the korban pesach. So therefore, the Gemara says it must be that the dispute between Rameir and the Chachamim of Chayesh L'Muta takes as a given that we say zil basaruba when there is no alternative, halachically, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether we follow the rule, whether we follow the general rule. So now we say, you know what? Everybody agrees zil basaruba in the case of a rubadisa come presumably, or at least in the voting case, and probably also in the nine stores, 10 stores, nine of which are kosher, probably. The dispute is only in the case of Ruba the Lessa Kaman, and now it turns out the dispute in the case of Ruba the Lessa Kaman is only when we have an alternative or we don't have an alternative. So the question is going to be, right, what, right, in that circumstance, right, where we have an alternative, right? Let's say we're talking about, or maybe eating meat generally is we have an alternative because the Torah says that eating meat is much. It's not a mitzvah always, but it's much. But when it comes to just a perfectly ordinary thing the Torah never says anything about, like for example, can I drink tap water without passing it through extreme filters to filter out the whatever the small insects are, or non-insect copepods, whatever it is, right? So even if right, so maybe I say, look, the Torah never says drink water, right? Just right. So okay, they're all without doing that. So maybe right. So right now you can imagine a world where we have to eliminate every possibility of sin, not just in the present, but even the possibility that something we'll do will, in retrospect, turn out to have been sin, and that'll be the position in there. And the question is, but why would what justifies any of us in doing anything else? Right? Why are we ever allowed to take risks? And then we ask you, is it really only about risk of sinning? Maybe the question is, right, generally in a situation where there's no risk of sin, what do we do when confronted with things, right, when confronted with probability cases, right? What does halacha think about probability? Maybe it just denies it. Now let's figure out so how do you calculate things, right? How do you make decisions in life? Whether or not that's it or not. Okay, that's the issue we're addressing. We'll come back in 3 weeks, I guess, right? Because I'll be away the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
I'll be away the next 2 weeks. So we'll come back and we'll redo the sugya somewhat, right? So we're not to remember everything cold, and we'll try and figure out what it might mean halachically, and then we'll go into the Rishimish. Right. Obviously, we'll talk about the Machloket Rashba and Rambam about whether we hold Safek Deraisa L'Chumra is Deraisa or Rabbanan, and then we'll talk about how that ties into Rishimish Shkap, and maybe the Telzer also. Okay. Thank you. That was fun. Yes.
With your eyes. Some chance that you won't.
Well, should is a dangerous word. The question is
I was joking.
for the record, Deborah was joking. It was just a biased suggestion. All right, we'll pick that up. I think the really interesting argument is going to be which Rabbi Cheses comes out with is maybe there are things that the Torah doesn't have to tell you. Just good people don't do that. Good.
I would. And if it is true that nobody has the authority to tell me what makes people treat, then why are we still 10 million different?
I don't know. We'll find out. Oh, I have not had such shake. Hedgehog drive one was a good person. Keep on here. Right. Okay. Happy post fast, everyone. Oh,